Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. I'd like to apologize in advance for me maybe rushing a little bit through this video. I do not have a ton of time to record today. I did take the time to analyze this chorale, and there's some tidbits that I'd like to spend more time to talk about, but I just don't have a lot of time to record today. I just have enough time to sort of get through this chorale, and I will touch on some of the points that are the most interesting, that I think are the hallmarks of this particular chorale, because it does have some unusual quirks about it that make it unique in comparison to some of the more normative chorales that we're used to hearing. Today's chorale is Hilf, Gott, mirs, gelingen, which translates to help God, the former of all things. Let's just hop right into the analysis. We have one flat in the key signature. We start on a bit of an ambiguous chord. We end on G major. So I think the overall tonality of this chorale is G minor, despite the fact that we start in the key of F. And this first chord, I believe, is a 7/6 chord. This E is the root of our chord, and this D is either an accented non-chord tone or some type of chordal seventh. Or you could analyze this chord as 2. I've talked at length in my videos about 7/6 versus 2 and how they're often contextualized with one another. I don't think a chord progression can really occur with one voice moving. That's just my opinion. If you feel like it can, you can reflect it in your analysis. There's definitely room for debate there, and it's one of the opinions that I hold personally relatively strongly, just based on my experience and the relationship I have with the music. But you don't need to have that same opinion as well. If you feel like this could be a 2 to 7 progression with one voice, or if you feel like this could just be a 2 chord going to a 1 chord, that's totally fine too. I just hear it as 7/6, and I feel like it makes more narrative sense to have a dominant chord go to a tonic chord in this context. I know it's not the perfect analysis, but I don't think there really is a perfect approach to what exactly is happening here. It's a really fascinating chord. But afterwards we have F major, F, C, F, and A, tonic triad, root position. We then have C, C, F, which is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and G. This is a 5 chord C major with a brief passing 7th in the tenor. And then we get D, A, D, and F, which is our 6 chord. A bit of a deceptive progression here. D minor, F, and A are both chord tones, so we don't need to mark them. And then we have B flat, F, B flat, and D, which is a 4 chord in root position. This could also be a 2/6 chord depending on how you view this G, sort of for the same reason why this D versus this E are, present some bit of a nebulous situation. All in all, it doesn't make too much of a difference because the chords are so similar in terms of structure and function. 6 wants to go to 2, but because it's 2/6, it could also be 4. I think it makes more sense because 4 is going to be going to basically a tonic chord on the next beat. But actually, instead of this being a tonic chord, because of the E flat here, this isn't just an F major chord, which would be functioning as a tonic. It is F major, A, C, and F. With this E flat, I think there's a higher function here, and it's actually 5/6 of 4. This E flat has a tendency to want to resolve to the 3 of the 4 chord, which would be D, or the 6 of the F major scale. But we get a really interesting chord progression that happens after the fact. So the E flat does resolve the way we would expect to D natural, but because F major basically occupies these 2 beats of the 3 beats of the measure, it takes us to a very interesting chord and another nebulous chord, which consists of D, G, B natural, and F. So I think one potential analysis is 5/4/3 of 5, G7 over D, but I think what makes a little bit more sense in terms of why this would move to a G, some type of dominant chord, is that if it were B diminished over D, which would be 7/6 of 5. And again, same reason if this was either 2/6 or 4, they're basically the same thing. Both of these chords function and consist of basically the same notes. The reason why I feel like 7/6 of 5 might be a bit more of an accurate analysis has to do with the preceding chord. So 5/6 of 4 would want to go to 4, which is B flat in the key of F, and this B natural is simply a a substitution for B flat. If you take a B flat chord and raise the root up a half step, you get B diminished, and that's exactly what 7/6 of 5 is, B diminished. So I feel like whether this is G7 or B diminished, they're basically the same chord, like I said, both in function and structure, and our half cadence ends with a 5 chord C, C, E, and G. Definitely very interesting opening phrase with room for interpretation regarding the chords, but all in all, it ends in a fairly straightforward half cadence if you sort of read in between the lines and look at the big picture of how this B natural is operating, which I feel like is a sub for B flat, rather than this being an F7 chord going to a G7 chord. I'd say the argument for F7 going to G7 would be maybe mode mixture and borrowing from the parallel minor, which would be C melodic minor, which I think is the only scale where F7 and G7 coexist, sort of in the tonal world of Bach. But because we cadence on a C major chord, I think that'd be more of an interesting argument to make, but I feel like it makes more sense. This is a B diminished. Moving ahead to the next phrase, I think it's entirely in the key of G minor, ends in a G minor perfect authentic cadence, and I think this C major chord is actually turning into our 4 chord in the key of G minor, sort of like G melodic minor. And as you can see, sort of melodic minor fragments occurring here in the alto, E being carried over, and then F sharp going to G. It's fairly straightforward here that maybe Bach is using 5 and turning it into 4 as a common chord between the two keys. It's not the first diatonic chord I would, expect Bach to use to move to the key of the supertonic, but here he is doing it, and 5 going to 4, this is not the first time he's done this. He actually does this quite frequently. So also kind of strengthening the analysis here, we have A, C, E, and A. You could make an argument this is a 2 chord, but I think it makes a little bit more sense if we view this C major chord as a 4 chord to look at this as an F sharp diminished chord over A, F sharp, A, C, and A, which is 7/6, kind of drawing a comparison, like I said, to the beginning of the previous phrase, which I feel kind of strengthens the analysis of the first phrase a bit, as Bach is always sort of recycling and repurposing and refiguring material. But after 7/6, we would expect to go to 1, which we do, G, D, G, and B flat, G minor. Neighboring 7th here in the alto before we get G, D, G, and B flat again. No need to reanalyze. A little delayed passing tone here in the tenor before we get B flat, G, and D, which is just taking our chord and putting it in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Passing tone in the tenor again. And then we get E flat, G, G, and C, which is C minor over E flat. That's a 4/6 chord. Another neighbor tone here before we get G, G, C, and E flat. Again, very similar measures here where a chord is getting repurposed on both beat 1 and beat 2, this F sharp being sort of a delayed neighbor tone before we get kind of an interesting chord progression, D, D, G, and B flat. This F sharp sort of makes me feel like we'd get a D major chord at least as a subdivision here, but this F sharp is sort of the bare minimum, sort of implying some type of dominant chord. Instead, we get 1/6/4 G minor over D, which is sort of a passing 1/6/4, right? Because the bass is consisting of stepwise motion in the same direction, which is a common configuration to C6/4 chords in these chorale settings. But after 1/6/4, we're getting ready for our cadence. We have C, we have E flat, we have G, and we have A, which is A minor 7 flat 5 over C. That's 2/6/5, and we would expect a 5 chord after that, and we sort of get one. We have D, D, G, and A, this G being a 4/3 suspension over the bass. A is a chord tone. We get the realization of the suspension on beat 3, D, D, F sharp, and A, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on G minor, G, B flat, D, and G. Root position G minor tonic triad. Moving ahead, we have a phrase in the key of F major, sort of a complement, or I guess create some continued symmetry between the form that was established in the A section. I think we pretty much modulate directly to the key of F major. If we look at this final cadence here and view this G minor chord as our 2 chord, it sort of continues to make a sensible normative progression in the key of F major moving forward. We have E, C, G, and C, which is C major over E, that's 5/6, passing 7th here in the tenor before we get F, A, G, and C, 9/8 suspension over the bass. This is a tonic triad, F major in root position. And then we have G, B flat, F, and C. Makes a little bit more sense to maybe analyze this C as a 4/3 suspension over the bass, where this E natural is our chord tone, and this would be a C7 chord over G, which is 5/4/3. And we're going to see a pattern here that is a variation on a very common pattern in Bach, and that is 1/7/6/1, 5/4/3 being a basically an extended 7/6 chord, not in the sense that we're adding notes to the end, but rather adding a note to the beginning, changing the root of the chord from, in this case, E to G, or sorry, E to C, because we're in the key of F major, not G minor, or C major in this case because it was a secondary harmony. But afterwards we would expect 1/6, A, C, F, and C, which is exactly what we get, F major over A, and that takes us to B flat, C, F, and D. Bit of an interesting chord. This C is like not a 9/8 suspension, but a 2/1 suspension over the bass, where we get a 4 chord, B flat major. E is a neighbor tone, F is a chord tone, G is a passing tone, B flat is the resolution to our suspension. Then we get F, C, A, and C, which is our tonic triad, F major in root position, passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the alto, before we get D, D, F, and B flat. Again, another B flat chord, that's 4/6 because it's in first inversion, passing tone in the bass before we get B, D, F, and A, which is technically taking our 4 chord, putting it in root position, but adding the 7th, because that's what this A is. So we could change the figure bass. We don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. And then we get C, G, F, and G, this F being a 4/3 suspension over the bass. We know that with dominant triads especially, we get a lot of 4/3 suspensions in Bach, at least in the chorales. C is a chord tone, E is the resolution to our suspension, and our phrase ends with our tonic, F, A, C, and A, F major in root position. The next phrase takes us to the key of G minor, and we're going to stay in G minor for the rest of the chorale. We have a bit of a modulation zone here where there are multiple points in which we can mark the modulation. I think it happens definitely before the E flat, so one of these 2 beats, but there's room for debate in terms of where the modulation occurs. I think we start off with B flat here being our 4 chord, B flat, D, and A, passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the alto, and then we get G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our 2 chord. Kind of an interesting progression because 4 going to 2, it's a lesser common progression. We see it, it's not unprecedented by any means, but it's still on the lesser common side of the progressions, and I do think G minor is now our tonic rather than our supertonic. We then have G, E flat, G, and B flat, which is our 6 chord, E flat major in first inversion, 6/6, and then we get F sharp, E flat, A, and A. I think this E flat's a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and this is actually a D7 chord, a D major chord over F sharp, which would be 5/6, and we would expect that to go to a tonic triad. In this case it does, G, D, A, and B flat, so our tonic triad is implied here, but by the time we get a resolution, the bass changes, and instead we get F, D, G, and B flat. There is some potential that this might be a tonic 7 chord in third inversion, but I actually think this F is an accented non-chord tone, and this is actually E flat 7, E flat, D, G, and B flat. So 6, 7 here in the key of G minor, and then we get D, E flat, A, and C. Sort of makes sense for 6 to go to 2 here, this C actually being our chord tone, A diminished over C, and that would take us presumably to our 5 chord, but instead we get a bit of a turnaround, one of the more unusual turnarounds where 2 takes us to 3, and the interesting nature between 2 and 3 in a minor key is that because it's a diminished chord going to a major chord, it inherently sounds like we're tonicizing it because we're preceding 3 with its dominant basically in terms of B flat, but I don't think we've modulated. I think we're just seeing sort of a, not necessarily a repetition, but a referencing to what happened earlier in the phrase where we have G leaping up to G, then that descending motion, but here we have B flat going up to B flat, then going down to A, and then it just turns into a descending, what I consider to be G sort of natural minor with the F natural and the E flat. So even though maybe it sounds like there's a brief departure to B flat, I don't think we're actually getting a modulation. So we have B flat here, which is our 3 chord, B flat, F, B flat, and D, which with a passing 7th in the alto, and then we get B flat, E flat, G, and D. I'm going to call this a 6-4-3 chord. You could also call this a 1-6 chord. I think they're both accurate analyses. The only reason why I call it a 6-4-3 chord has to do with 3 wanting to go to 6, and typically when 2 doesn't go to a 5 chord and it turns into like a turnaround, it kind of takes us in a direction where we expect to see a normative chord progression that will then take us to a sort of a cadential situation. We see this from time to time in Bach, so 2 going to 3, and then this either turns into an adjacent chord progression or some type of cyclical chord progression, sometimes descending by 5th, sometimes by other means. But after our 6-4-3 chord, it actually doesn't go where we would expect. It goes to a very logical place, but instead of going to 2 or to 5, it goes to 7. We have A, E, G, and C. Sorry, this is E flat. So there is potential here that this is a 2-7 chord, an A minor 7 flat 5 chord, but I think this G is actually a 7-6 suspension over the bass, and by analyzing it that way, this E flat would be an accented non-chord tone, and instead we have F sharp, A, and C, which would make this a 7-6 chord, maybe even a 7-6-5 chord, depending on whether or not you want to lump that E flat in there. That's largely like minute, doesn't make a huge difference whether you analyze this as 7-6 or 7-6-5. That's entirely up to you. But regardless, the 7 chord does resolve to a tonic triad, which I feel makes a little bit more sense than a 2 chord going to a tonic triad, a la the first progression that we saw, as well as the first progression of the second phrase that we analyzed. We have G, D, G, and B flat, our tonic triad, with a passing tone here in the tenor. Could potentially be a 6-6 chord again as well, but I hear this mostly as a tonic triad, especially in terms of the grander scheme of the progression and trying to pick out something normative that's bringing us to a cadence, which we're basically in here. We have F, F, D, and B flat. This is a B flat major chord over F. Very unusual chord here, 1 going to 3, 6, 4, kind of operating as maybe like a substitute for 7, maybe operating as a substitute for, I don't know, actually, when we see this descending line, it's kind of an interesting way to approach 4, because not only is this a half cadence in the key of G minor, but it's a Phrygian half cadence, and we're approaching Phrygian just by this descending line, and with the line descending this way, we're bound to get an interesting chord progression because we're going to run into chords that don't typically follow one after the other. Not that there's anything wrong with them, it's just we don't expect to see chords that follow one another in this fashion. But with that logic, A is like a delayed 7th, F is still a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, and then we get E flat, G, D, and G. It's very possible that this is a 6-7 chord, but I think, as I've talked about with other half cadences, more specifically Phrygian half cadences, we have one of two things happening. We either have an ambiguous situation where the chord could be one chord, either a 2-4-3 chord or a 6-7 chord, or a 4-6 chord. The alternate Phrygian half cadence would involve a 4-6 chord going to 5, where there really is an argument. It's just a plain old 4-6 chord. And because the 4-6 chord is pretty much always extrapolatable from the texture, I'm inclined to believe that this is a 4-6 chord. 3 wanting to go to 6 is very valid, but we also see 3 going to 4-6, or 3 going to 4 with just as much frequency, so it's a toss-up. I'm going to call it a 4-6 chord just because of the fact that it is in line with sort of my experience analyzing Bach. Also, we would 4-6 chord is a complete chord. This would be an incomplete 6-7. Not to say that incomplete chords aren't valid analyses. I feel like it just takes maybe 1 or 2 points away from it outruling this being a 4-6 chord. So yeah, it's mostly nebulous. It doesn't really matter too much in the grand scheme of things. What we need to know is that this is a half cadence and the predominant is some type of 4 or 6 chord. Either way, we do cadence on 5, D, A, D, and F sharp. It's also kind of unusual for the third of the chord to be in the melody. It's usually the fifth of the chord, but that's not a codified convention. It's just a stylistic thing I've noticed Bach write with. Like here, for example, half cadence with the fifth of the chord in the melody. Our last phrase does take us out in the key of G minor. Fairly straightforward phrase, all things considered, ends in a perfect authentic cadence, and we start off with 5, D, D, F sharp, and A. Just a bit of vocal rotation, no need to reanalyze. That takes us to G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, tonic triad. Then we get G, E flat, G, and B. That's just a 6 chord in first inversion. This E flat's a chord tone and leaves us with a complete triad after the fact, so we briefly go to root position here, and I could reflect that in the figured bass, and that takes us to an interesting chord, B flat, D, F, and D. What makes this chord interesting is that it's what I've been calling a transitive progression. Typically 3 wants to go to 6, right? Just by cycle of falling fifths. 3 going down to 6 is a fifth going down. But that same voice leading could take 6 to 3 if you went in the opposite direction, and we see Bach do that all the time, and it just provides him with another angle to then approach the dominant from a different direction, and that's exactly what's going to happen here. We see 3 actually turn into an interesting chord to 4-2, B flat, G, E, and C, sort of melodic minor here with E natural and F sharp, so this would be a C 7 chord over B flat in the key of G minor. That is a 4-2 chord. And we would expect this to resolve to 7-6, which coincidentally it does. A, C, E flat, and C. I guess you could make the argument it is a 2 chord, a 2 diminished chord, but I think actually this E flat, based on the way that we know how 4-2 chords resolve, this is most likely a 7-6 chord. Again, really 2 and 7 coinciding with one another is a very common occurrence. The difference between 2 and 7 is just a whole step. In the key of G minor, it's F sharp versus E or E flat. And actually, you know what? This would not be a 2 diminished chord because this is an E flat. This is E natural. All in all, I feel like 7-6 is strongly favored here in terms of the correct analysis because of the 4-2 chord preceding it, and sort of just comments on the fact that Bach does play with the idea of chords having multiple identities that are separated by stepwise motion. Because every chord, if you just alter one of its tones by a whole step, or if you alter the what would it be? So 2 going to 7, that would be A minor versus F sharp diminished. If you take one tone and you move it by step, you end up just changing the entire quality of the chord while maintaining the majority of the pitches. So 4 also wants to go to 7. It's just a normative progression. We would expect 1 to follow it, which it does. It just makes more sense for me to analyze it that way. But you could use 2 as well because it's there. It's something that you can pull out of the texture. But we do get G minor after the fact. G, B flat, G, and B flat. Kind of an interesting spelling. 2 roots, 2/3, but still a G minor chord regardless. We do get that D on the end of the beat. No need to reanalyze, or we don't need to mark that because it is a chord tone. And then we're closing in on our final progression here, our cadential progression. We start off with C, E flat, G, and A. It's A minor 7 flat 5 over C. D is a passing tone. We then have A, C, G, and A. Almost an A minor 7 flat 5 chord. We're just missing the flat 5, so I'll just consider this counterpoint in anticipation for our dominant, which pretty much always follows our 2-6-5 chord. D, C, F sharp, and A. It's 5, 7, D7 in root position. A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G. Major tonic triad. Bach often ends his minor chorales with major tonic triads. I think it has to do with his relationship with major chords having more of a final impact, or maybe he wants to end on a more uplifting note. There's lots of speculation there, but it's more common for him to end his minor chorales with a major triad than for him to not. But other than that, that's today's analysis. And really, there isn't anything in this chorale. Actually, no, I'm going to take that back. I was going to say there wasn't really anything in this chorale other than sort of the unusual progressions here and there that were to write home about, or anything that I was taking personal note of in my my personal notes. But I will say that maybe the hallmark of this chorale, at least in terms of things that I'm looking for across all of the chorales, is this secondary deceptive progression. It's probably amongst the most unusual of secondary deceptive progressions I've seen. Typically, if we see a secondary dominant, it'll, in the context of a secondary deceptive progression, it'll resolve to a chord that is diatonic to the key, like 5, 6 of 4 going to, what would that be, to 6? No, was that right? 5, 6 of 4 would be F, and we would expect that to go to G, so like 5, 6 of 4 going to 2, sorry, not 6, going to 2, but here we see it, instead of going to 2, going to 7, 6 of 5, which is just a substitute for 4, like we talked about earlier, B natural being a half step above the root of the chord. We would have expected 5, 6 of 4 to resolve to, so I think it makes more sense to analyze it as 5, 6 of 4, even though 5, 4, 3 of 5 is also, sorry, 7, 6 of 5 rather than 5, 4, 3 of 5. Getting my numbers mixed up there. I get mixed up pretty easily. My dyslexia kicks in when I have a lot of information on the page, so these wrap-ups are helpful and also a little bit difficult for me to organize. But that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in today's chorale. I was actually able to get a lot of information out in a video that could have easily been 45 minutes, so I hope the video was helpful. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.